Life's a forge. Yes, and hammer and anvil too. You'll be roasted, smelted, and pounded, and you'll scarce know what's happening to ya. But stand boldly to it. Metal's worthless till it's shaped and tempered. More labor than luck. Face the pounding. Don't fear the proving. And you'll stand well against any hammer and anvil.
Code Bunny is a 2D action platformer developed by Team 7-Star and released on itch.io in 2024. There are plans for a Steam release later the same year. Full disclosure, Team 7-Star reached out to the Experience Point directly to request their game be covered in a deconstruction video and has provided a review copy of Code Bunny. While this marks a significant milestone for the Experience Point as a channel and, as its steward, means the world to me personally, I can assure you that the opinions represented in this video, just like any other, will remain unbiased. My goal is always to provide a thorough deconstruction of a game and analyze all of its constituent parts to identify what works and what doesn't, and deep dive into the reasons why. Being honest about all of the good and the bad that a game has to offer is the driving force behind all of my videos and is a defining part of this channel's integrity. What this means for you as a viewer is that you can trust that there will be no embellishments and any praise given to Code Bunny has been fully earned. By the same token, for the members of Team 7-Star that may be watching this video, please understand that any criticisms come with the best of intentions. Life's a forge after all. Stand well against the hammer and anvil. Lagos Hyperbolics, an advanced technology company, has teamed up with the planet Lumna's government, Xanadu, to conceive the VY space program, a project aimed at gathering Aethr, the most powerful energy source ever discovered, from Comet let's say Yliaster? Comet Yliaster. When explosions start going off and destruction begins to unfold on Lumna, Lagos deploys a combat team that includes Hazel and Axel, the playable characters, to deal with what initially seems to be an eco-terrorist group responsible for the sudden violence. This gives the initial impression that the story is going to be focused primarily on the timeless mankind's hubris and endless greed as they exploit nature theme that has been famously explored in countless works of fiction from Final Fantasy VII to James Cameron's Avatar movies, and can also be seen by simply looking out the window, or, going outside. Surprisingly, this is actually not what Code Bunny is about at all. And while it does have a rather grandiose overarching narrative, it spends most of its time focusing instead on its characters, their motivations, and their histories. The story is considerably more developed than is typical of games in this genre. There is significant backstory for both the world and its characters, some unexpected twists, and some surprisingly emotional scenes. The dialogue is enjoyable due in part to the fact that every character has their own distinct personality, which makes the interactions between them feel authentic, and there are even some genuinely funny moments. That said, the dialogue does feel like it occupies too much of the game's total playtime. That isn't to say that there is too much dialogue, but simply that the dialogue seems to occupy more time than the gameplay itself. You see, many game narratives start out with only a very rough outline. Levels, sequences, story beats, and set pieces are created first, and then the finer details of the story are fabricated afterward in an attempt to tie all of these elements together. Code Bunny seems to have taken a different approach. A comprehensive narrative, complete with world building, character backstories, and even philosophical musings, was lovingly crafted and then shoved in between levels of a Mega Man tribute. This doesn't mean that the game design and atmosphere aren't informed by the story, because they certainly are. Everyone on the development team was clearly on the same page about the product they were trying to deliver, and it shows. It's just that various parts of the game are delivered to the player in a way that's a bit disproportionate. In other words, it's a bit unusual for games in this genre to have quite this much reading relative to its gameplay. The key word here is pacing. And unfortunately, Code Bunny's issues with pacing are twofold. Not only does the gameplay suffer due to the frequent and extended interruptions created by the narrative, specifically the dialogue, but the dialogue itself also has pacing issues. It definitely seems like Team 7 Star was aware that the dialogue was taking up an unfair allotment of the player's time and attention, and so the writers tried to accelerate the pace of the plot. They were right on the money in regards to facilitating gameplay, but unfortunately this led to certain character interactions feeling a bit forced. Sometimes time and history are needed to establish the credibility required to create impactful character moments, but not every narrative thread was fleshed out enough for these moments to work. Sometimes they did, and sometimes they did not. Overall, Code Bunny offers a fresh take on some familiar themes and provides some genuinely interesting and well-written characters through which to discover them. The story that wants to be told here is a little too ambitious to be explored in a game of this length, but it's not like it fails to get the point across. The story, overall, is good, even if its execution wasn't perfect. I hope to someday see what the writers could accomplish with a longer game or a more story-oriented genre. The visuals in Code Bunny are of a minimalist pixel art style and overall look pretty good. It's clear that Team 7 Star has some talented artists on board. The sprites aren't the highly detailed variants you'd expect from the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis era, but more akin to fully realized NES graphics unbridled by infinitesimal computer memory or a limited color palette. Smart choices were made to bring the anime-style concept art faithfully into the pixel aesthetic, but of course, some concessions were made. The limited amount of detail required the team to be especially conscious of their use of shapes and colors for the characters, enemies, and levels. The animations are fluid and clear and are probably the highlight of Code Bunny's visuals. Team 7 Star managed to pack a ton of detail into its animations without compromising on its minimalistic aesthetic. From the little things like Hazel's hair flapping just a little bit behind her as she runs, to the more visually arresting, such as the afterimage that follows her when she dashes, there was clearly a significant effort made to bring the movement in Code Bunny to life. Each level takes place in its own particular part of the world and offers its own distinct visual style. No two levels really feel the same. The comet in the background of the levels is a neat touch and helped in establishing the game world for the player to immerse themselves in. However, within the levels themselves, there is a bit of visual repetition and there could have been better signposting. In this context, signposting is creating unique visual elements within the level that identify that exact part of the level. In general, it would be ideal if a player could, at a glance, look at a screenshot from a level and know exactly where in the level the screenshot is from. A greater variety to the structures and especially the backgrounds would have not only helped bring each level to life, but also facilitated the player's sense of progression and accomplishment as they make their way from the beginning to the end of each level. For its particular graphical style, the artists at Team 7 Star have done solid work. There are some minor inconsistencies in the art style due to its generally low fidelity, and it probably could have benefited from a greater variety of background designs and color choices. But the end result is still highly functional, and the animations in particular stand out among the competition. In short, Code Bunny does a lot with a little. The music is super fun, and I enjoyed every bit of it. The tracks range from upbeat and adventurous to solemn and contemplative. The songs do a good job of establishing mood and enhancing the overall experience. The designers also use silence to great effect. Knowing when to start playing music to accentuate the story or when to play nothing at all is an incredibly powerful tool that was handled very well here. The sound effects themselves are all very appropriate and satisfying. They sound exactly like they should. I especially loved how chunky and thick Hazel's sword sounds when hitting an enemy. And given the very limited sound profile being employed here, the designers have done an excellent job with clarity. The sounds aren't just nice to listen to, but they're informative. Take this shielded enemy, for example. It's immediately conveyed to the player through audio feedback that they are not doing normal damage. This is not only important for conveying information to the player, but it's another example of Team 7 Star's attention to detail. It is safe to say that Code Bunny is a treat for the ears. The soundtrack perfectly emulates the vibes of the 8 and 16-bit era games that inspired it, while also matching the game's style and tone. The music, in particular, was one of my favorite parts of the game. Seriously, Lavi, Alame, if you're interested in making a tune or two for this channel, let me know. I have always wanted some custom 8-bit tracks for these videos. Before discussing gameplay, it's important to establish that there are two different characters the player can choose to play as, and therefore, two different gameplay experiences. The first, and honestly best, choice is to play as the sword-wielding headliner Hazel. In addition to her melee combo and a parry, she also has access to the Ghost Crescent ability. With Ghost Crescent, she can fire arrows at enemies, and while the arrows themselves aren't meant for doing damage, they give Hazel the ability to dash to any enemies marked by the arrows. The amount of damage done to enemies with Ghost Crescent is determined by how much karma that Hazel has amassed. Karma is effectively a traditional combo system. The only caveat here is that increased karma also increases the damage that Hazel takes from enemies, which makes it a bit of a double-edged sword. The player wants to build and maintain large combos, but it's a risk and reward system wherein the player must decide when and where to spend their karma or suffer the consequences. Additionally, the Ghost Crescent allows Hazel to double jump off of enemies that she's dashed to. This means that the Ghost Crescent is not only her special attack, but her primary tool for platforming. This is an absolutely solid gameplay loop. Building up karma is fun, and the payoff of increasing the Ghost Crescent's damage for having higher karma is great. Tying it into the platforming is brilliant. Zipping from enemy to enemy is a blast, and mastery of this tool makes the character and the player feel powerful. Furthermore, the creative potential for these core gameplay skills is just as high as the skill ceiling it creates. There are so many ways in which the Ghost Crescent can be used to create unique and interesting encounters, platforming challenges, and boss fights. As soon as it sort of clicked for me, I began salivating at the thought. I was legitimately stoked to see what the rest of the game had in store for me. Unfortunately, it seems that neither myself nor the designers at Team 7 Star have fully mastered the Ghost Crescent yet. I'll get straight to the point. Code Bunny's level design is its biggest opportunity for improvement, and honestly, just not quite up to par with the rest of the game. That isn't to say that it's bad, but that it just doesn't reach its full potential. In fact, there are some things that the levels do very well. For example, each level has multiple paths through it. In this regard, it's very similar to the classic Sonic games, and by classic, I'm specifically referring to the original trilogy. There are higher and lower sections of the level. This is a neat gameplay concept that rewards player performance, encourages exploration, and, theoretically, adds replay value. The higher path tends to require more skill and familiarity with the level to stay on, and the lower path is the punishment for not having that skill and or familiarity. The higher path offers more opportunities to gain and maintain high speed and build combos, while the lower path tends to be slower paced and more combat oriented. Just like in Sonic, the end result is more or less the same, and there is some ability to return to the higher path from the lower one. Sometimes. There was one level that I originally felt frustrated with that actually ended up becoming one of my favorites. Let me explain. So, because of the color palette and other design choices made here, it is easy for the player to accidentally fall from the higher path to the lower one. This seemed like an extremely obvious oversight and would clearly annoy most players. So, I wondered why the level couldn't have been designed with a clearer distinction between the walkable platforms and the ones that aren't. However, there is a method to the madness. The player is expected to learn that this level is not all that it seems, and there is a gimmick involved that will need to be understood and taken advantage of in order to complete the level. Essentially, there actually is no lower path in this level. When the character falls through the bottom of the screen, they're actually returned to the top of it, Pac-Man style. This level is designed around this concept, and some areas are only passable once this distinction is made. It's a creative concept, and I like the execution of it in this game. Furthermore, because the aesthetic is so aggressively intent on ensuring that the player falls through the floor, what seems like an annoyance originally is actually a way of helping them to understand the concept earlier. Is it subtle? Not particularly, but it is clever, and the revelation was still satisfying, even if it was a little bit heavy-handed. Okay, So, cool. Now, let's talk about what the levels could have done differently. So, first of all, they're short. They're very short. They are also not particularly challenging, at least not to simply clear them. However, to get the highest rank on a level, well, that's a bunny of a different color. The disparity between simply passing a level and walking away from it with an S+ is massive. Whether or not this is a positive or a negative will probably vary from player to player, but to me, the S+ conditions felt totally out of reach. How am I supposed to showcase absolute mastery of a game that hasn't even taught me how to properly play it by the time the credits roll? That said, if a player takes the initiative to grind out the S+ ranks in these levels, there is a sense of satisfaction that comes along with the experience. Seeing what me and Hazel were capable of was pretty cool. It just seems like there should have been more of a focus on getting the player at least closer to this experience without requiring them to grind out high ranks in levels they've already completed. The game's difficulty in general also has a bit of a pacing issue. There is a significant difficulty spike when reaching the boss called Raffi that is certainly noticeable, and another difficulty spike with the last boss. Furthermore, because the levels are so short, aren't replayable in the first playthrough, and because they aren't particularly focused on combat, I didn't feel like I had the opportunity to develop the skills needed to defeat these bosses before actually facing them. Instead, I had to learn the skills required to beat them by first failing to them. In general, boss fights work best when they're the summary of the skills and techniques the player has had the opportunity to learn and practice beforehand, like a test at the end of each chapter. With Code Bunny, however, I felt like the boss fights, specifically the last boss fight, were the first time I was pushed to start learning to play the game proper. There were also a few other opportunities for improvement. One of which is that a larger variety of enemies would have made level sections more interesting and could have allowed combat to be fleshed out more. Most enemies fail to offer any real challenge in terms of combat and seem to exist merely to facilitate platforming, which ties directly into the next point. Code Bunny has some interesting and challenging platforming sections. The player can use enemies to reach difficult heights, explore different paths, and visit various level sections. It's just that there's no real point. Some of these routes can be used for pursuing higher ranks in that level, but even that isn't always a guarantee. I'll come back to the level ranks in just a minute, but outside of that, there's nothing new to see or do or collect. In my playthrough, I remember that I kept feeling like there should be secrets, areas of interest, or some other kind of reward, but there just aren't any. Perhaps this could have been a good way to solve both the problem with excess dialogue as well as create a reward for players. Text logs, flashbacks, radio transmissions between characters, or even cutscenes could be the thing that the player gets for accomplishing challenging platforming feats. This would have given both the design team and the writers the ability to more fully flesh out their content while also giving the player agency over whether or not they're interested in pursuing said content. It would have made the game as a whole feel not only more interesting, but more well-rounded and complete. Overall, I really enjoyed my time with Hazel and would probably have a better overall impression of the game had it ended there. There is, however, a second character to play as, Axel. Unlike Hazel, Axel does not have a sword, and he does not have the Ghost Crescent. Instead, Axel spins on his skates. He spins to attack, he spins to dodge, he spins to parry, and his spin even bounces off of enemies to enable his double jump and create platforming opportunities. He also has some special moves that seemed kind of cool, but I absolutely never used them because I never needed to or felt like they were particularly useful. I literally mashed one button repeatedly from the beginning to the end of Axel's playthrough, and I was never excited with, interested in, or satisfied by Axel's gameplay. There was exactly one exception to this, and it was during a specific boss fight. Without spoiling it, I'll just say that it felt very true to Axel's character and, surprisingly, was one of Code Bunny's best moments. Now, let's talk about the level ranks. In terms of gameplay, this is Code Bunny's bread and butter. The developers and the game itself are dangerously reliant upon this concept to engage the player and heighten the gameplay experience. And, well, yeah, As mentioned before, achieving those high ranks is fun and satisfying, and it feels very much like how Code Bunny was intended to be played. Now, expecting players to achieve a high level of performance can be the linchpin of a game's design, but it has to be done carefully. It can be done through a gradual escalation of difficulty, which is the most common way games handle it, and it can be seen in everything from Mega Man to Monster Hunter to Dark Souls. It can also be done more subversively, such as with Neon White, where the player gradually develops new skills one at a time through experience, repetition, and often failure. Or it can be done with a reward system, which Code Bunny, like many other games, has chosen. This can be handled any number of ways: high scores, achievements, unlockables, bonus content, new lore, or even a cheesy little cutscene at the end of the game. It can also be done with a ranking system, such as has been done here. The point is that the player should feel enticed enough by some kind of reward that they want to continue to engage with the game even after the credits roll. The thing is, whichever route the developer chooses, this is a balancing act that has to be handled very carefully. In most cases, the game needs to stand on its own without forced replayability, and ideally should do so by offering a substantial morsel of what the player can expect if they choose to pursue endgame content. Games previously deconstructed on this channel, Hi-Fi Rush and Gravity Circuit, are examples of games that handled this gracefully. But I would say that this is where Code Bunny stumbles a little bit. The difference between simply completing a level and completing it with an S+ rank is so great that they feel like two entirely different experiences, as opposed to two different versions of the same experience. Furthermore, it is exactly because of this disparity that the gameplay experience in one's initial playthrough of Code Bunny falls a bit shy of its potential. It can be argued that the first playthrough is simply to experience the game's story and its characters and its world, and that subsequent playthroughs can then focus on its gameplay, but to that I would counter, why not both? The experience doesn't need to be so divided. Giving the player a bit more to chew on gameplay-wise in their first playthrough, and then rewarding them with additional dialogue, cutscenes, and other story elements for pursuing excellence in their subsequent playthroughs could have offered a more refined experience for the audience. And in my opinion, it would have. But I acknowledge that it is entirely possible that no small number of players may very well prefer the way that Team 7-Star has so cleanly compartmentalized its constituent parts. Code Bunny has a lot of good things going for it. There is some occasional indie game jank that's really not worth mentioning, much less dwelling on, because it has no real impact on the game. The pixel art holds up just fine against an endless sea of similar looking games, the aesthetic is cute, and the vibe is enjoyable. The music is delightful. Hazel and her Ghost Crescent are a dynamite concept. I would have loved to see a version of Code Bunny that spent its resources fleshing it out more. Ditching Axel altogether to focus on longer, more challenging, and more varied levels and bosses that took advantage of the Ghost Crescent and all its potential could have elevated Code Bunny to genuine excellence. Overall, I liked Code Bunny, but more importantly, I like Team 7-Star. I think their first outing in the game development world speaks volumes about the team, and even more than the product they've delivered, I'm excited about their potential. And I very much look forward to seeing what they do next.